Good evening and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this launch event of our latest issue brief, a next generation agenda for US-ROK-Japan trilateral cooperation. This event culminates our research project, which included a series of roundtables hosted by the Atlantic Council's Indo-Pacific Security Initiative, which is housed within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, done in partnership with the Korea Foundation. And we're thrilled to have you join us for what is sure to be a very exciting discussion. My name is Marcus Garlauskas. I'm a non-resident senior fellow with the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative, which again is within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and I'm delighted to open today's session. We're joined by the authors of this issue brief, Lauren Gilbert, Kyoko Imai, and Sang-Hyun Han, two additional project participants as well, Rosa Park-Tokola and Eleanor Sherry-Hughes. Today's discussion will cover the key recommendations developed over the course of this project, which aims to inform concrete policy recommendations for US-ROK-Japan trilateral cooperation in three areas: security and defense, science and technology, and global public goods. As you all know well, if you're attending this session, trilateral cooperation among the United States and two of its closest Indo-Pacific allies, the Republic of Korea and Japan, are integral to security, prosperity, and freedom in the Indo-Pacific. And as such, the United States has long sought cooperation and continues to actively engage for cooperation in these areas. While the historically fraught relationship between South Korea and Japan has presented obstacles to consistent and productive cooperation, in light of the new era of strategic competition that we're seeing and in an increasingly turbulent geopolitical landscape, along with recent turnovers in leadership, the three countries have demonstrated renewed interest in trilateral cooperation. In defining areas where targeted, flexible, and informal cooperative arrangements among the three countries can provide clear mutual benefit and thus create a foundation for deeper integration moving forward, this issue brief is integral to the mission of the Scowcroft Center, where we work to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. The center also honors the legacy of General Brent Scowcroft and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. And in this spirit, this project uniquely brings next generation perspectives to the forefront of the conversation. And it's my pleasure to get things started here as your moderator for the evening and the morning, as the case may be. And I'm very glad to say you're in for a real treat. I know several of the panelists here very well and have the chance to work with them closely, and I know all of them by their work and by their excellent reputations. So we're going to use a Q&A format here where I'm going to provide some questions to the panel, and we're going to talk a little bit about the report itself, and then we're going to open to questions from the audience. So I encourage you to put those questions into the Q&A function in the chat, and our team will vet them, and then with the time available, then I'll bring those questions up and ask them to the panel. And so our goal is to get through the discussion within the panel that I'll be moderating with about 20 minutes or so left for some questions, after which we will have some closing comments from the acting director of the Scowcroft Center, Dr. Matthew Kranig. Without any further preamble, then, I think we should just jump right in and hear from Lauren. How did this project come about? How did it get started? Where the ideas come from? Tell us the story of how this came to be.
Of course, yes, and thank you so much, Marcus. As you already described, trilateral cooperation amongst the United States, Republic of Korea, and Japan are very important to the security, prosperity, and freedom in the Indo-Pacific. We see recently the Biden administration has made trilateral cooperation a priority for U.S. foreign policy, and we see the highlighting of defense, non-traditional security issues, including science and technology, climate change, public health, and more. So to advance this trilateral cooperation more effectively over time, we think that it's necessary for next generation experts for all of these countries to explore innovative methods and sort of action-oriented policy proposals. So in pursuit of this, and in partnership with the Korea Foundation, who very kindly sponsored this project, the Atlantic Council convened the 3 private roundtables with each of the different subject matters that we see in the chapters of our issue brief. And we really wanted to get rising American, South Korean, and Japanese career and experts so that we could get all of the perspectives from the 3 countries directly, rather than just focusing on, a sort of biased perspective. We wanted to get a very well-rounded view of the issues. And so this created a next generation trilateral network that we hope to continue working with through over the time. And we discussed all of these challenges and opportunities for how we can actually move forward and push forward that sort of general cooperation, but also moving forward into a next generation type of cooperation rather than the sort of back and forth that we've seen so far. So we really wanted to really bring in an emphasis on how policymakers can work together to implement this agenda now and moving into the future.
Lauren, that's a great explanation. And it really is an exciting concept, right, of recognizing that this is a problem that has such a long history in terms of the obstacles to trilateral cooperation. I think pairing this with the idea of looking at rising scholars, rising experts in a new generation makes a lot of sense to me, because it is going to take, I think, a certain degree of generational shifts to really get ROK, US and Japan trilateral cooperation to the next level. The only issue I have is I'm not sure next generation is quite the right term, because you all are the generation of now, and not just next. You're already making a difference with this work and in your day-to-day positions in the various organizations, including, of course, the two of you that work here, at the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. So I think at this point, it'd be a good idea to give the audience an overview of the 3 chapters of the report. And so Lauren, Sang-Hyun, and Kyoko, if you could just go in sequence and give just a brief overview. And of course, I'm going to encourage people to read the full report, so don't feel like you have to go into all the details, but I think it'll be a good jumping off point for discussion and give everybody kind of the big picture. So Lauren, since I understand you wrote the first chapter, if you can go ahead and go first.
Of course, yes. So I do want to flag that this was definitely a team effort, not just with the people you see on screen, but with the entire just network of next generation scholars. But I did spearhead the writing on the chapter for security and defense. And in this chapter, we try and go beyond the common areas of discussion, sort of the historical issues and large foreign military exercises, and really identify new sort of novel areas of cooperation and opportunities. So first, we lay out 3 common challenges beyond the sort of history and the related conflicts there. And so we find first leadership transitions in the 3 capitals and how they can very easily affect the levels of trilateral cooperation. So we see progress in under one leader, and then another leader comes in and we lose that progress because of a lack of institutionalization. So that's one of the main problems that we found through the roundtables. And then second, we see the diverging threat perceptions among the 3 countries. They have different priorities naturally as 3 different countries, but those diverging perceptions among who is the largest threat, who is the not as immediate threat, that causes issues when you're trying to create a unified policy. So that's another issue that we found. And then third, it's the threat of economic retaliation on the part of China can cause a lot of hesitation amongst the countries on how we can move forward on a set strategy, a set agenda, etc. So despite these challenges, we have seen signs of willingness to cooperate through high-level summits between the country's leaders. So despite the aforementioned challenges, we put together a few recommendations to improve this trilateral cooperation. So first, we have these concerns about either China or about domestic political concerns. So instead of focusing on highly sensitive areas of cooperation, such as large-scale military exercises, the country should opt for security cooperation in newer areas or less sensitive areas. So we're talking crisis contingency planning, combating illegal fishing, and sort of maritime incursions. And then another one is focusing on new frontiers to optimize areas of cooperation that won't serve as a flashpoint. And a prime one that we found is cyberspace. So this can include information sharing on cyber threats, coordinating technology transfers, bolstering cyber defenses, etc. Another one we found is that rather than developing solely a framework for collective defense against coercive economic measures such as supply chain attacks, but also employ proactive economic stance, such as forming novel trade agreements with regional partners and collaborating to enforce sanctions when necessary, so that they don't constantly worry about what will happen, such as in the case of THAAD or if there are export bans. Then we also found that the trilateral group should aim to institutionalize security cooperation mechanisms. This will in turn enhance interoperability, but also consistency in the cooperation. So to avoid arousing domestic political pushbacks, this trilateral cooperation should be achieved through multilateral frameworks rather than bilateral or trilateral agreements. And those are some of the main points that I wanted to cover, but as Marcus said, please do read for a lot more detail.
All right, Lauren, that was great, and I'll certainly have some follow-up questions on it. I'm sure the audience will, but that was an excellent overview. So now let's go to Sang Kim.
Thank you, Marcus. Also, on the top of what Lauren just said, laying out the purpose of this project, this is also outcome of the intellectual gathering. And also, I want to begin by raising like two initial thoughts and move on to the like issue brief afterwards. The first one is the importance of S&T sector. So I feel like there's no need to express how and why science and technology S&T is important, especially in the era of US-China competition. And in this sense, rely on partners to advance international technology ecosystem is crucial for S&T cooperation, and US cooperation with South Korea and Japan as a technology-faring countries is critical to success of S&T. A second point that I want to raise is a timely manner of this report. Given this attention of S&T sector and necessity of trilateral cooperation, however, I feel like there is a little attention and research on especially like how S&T trilateral cooperation will unfold compared to like other areas such as conventional security areas. Therefore, I'm really glad that we as an extern group discussed this issue and as well as eventually illustrate and propose some like a feasible suggestions. So for the like issue brief, we come up with three challenges that three countries are facing, but also at the same time, this could be the opportunity to revive the trilateral cooperation in science and technology area. The first challenge would be science and technology is driven with private sector, not solely by governments. So I feel like this is a kind of a unique feature of S&T cooperation compared to other conventional areas such as I said, economy or like security. And also the introduction of another actor called like private sector could make the cooperation equation more complicated than as it is now. And also, secondly, not surprisingly, historical like legacy also matters. And the symbolic case of this would be Japanese like export control case in raw material for semiconductor imposes against South Korea due to decision by the Supreme Court. And lastly, authoritarian regimes such as China or like Russia's endeavor to seize the leadership in emerging technologies are formulating more and more competitive ambience in science technology. So having said that, we come up with, and also as like Lauren emphasizes, we are trying to aiming to suggest noble and impact-oriented approach. In the sense, we come up with 4 recommendations on how 3 capitals can pursue the cooperation in the science and technology areas. The first one is private and public partnership is very keen to S&T cooperation. Pursuing public-private collaboration in a trilateral way will facilitate S&T paper, science and technology. And second recommendation is, I feel like it is time to initiate like a working level meetings to come up with like a feasible policy actions rather than voices. I would argue there has been sufficient discussion by higher or like a senior level officials, such as the launching of ministerial level supply chain and commercial dialogue and economic security dialogue between the 2 national security councils. I feel like so this is time for like implementation rather than just echoing the voices. The third point we want to raise is a public awareness, and its desire for trilateral cooperation is very essential. Domestic politics and public opinion always have influence on trilateral cooperation, while decisions made by private sectors can be also affected by this domestic politics. In the sense, not only top-down approach, but also bottom-up approach motivated by publics who acknowledge the necessity and educated the necessity of it is likely to be more amplifying the flame of corporations. And the last point is, given the kind of embryonic stage of norms and international institution, or especially emerging technologies, trilateral cooperation needs to be pursued by establishing norms based on shared value and principles, such as democratic values. I'll stop here and more than happy to explain in the detail at the further discussions.
That's another great description, and I have to tell you, your focus on looking at actors below the state level and the role of domestic politics and of non-government actors here, I think is really an important issue that's often overlooked, not just on trilateral cooperation, but in so many other areas in the national security space. So I really found that resonated with me a great deal. So look forward to following up on that as well. So now let's go to Kyoko.
Great, thank you, Marcus. So for this chapter, which is focused on global public goods, this, of the three topics that we covered, it definitely offers the most promise for cooperation, given the high mutual benefit and low sensitivity associated with this issue. However, there's still a number of challenges faced by the three countries when trying to deliver as much impact as possible to partners in the Indo-Pacific and to play to their respective strengths. As you all know, public goods is a huge topic, and so we chose to focus on 4 key issues, which are public health, climate change, foreign aid, and democratic values. So I'll briefly talk about the 4 issues, but we can obviously delve further into these issues as the discussion goes on tonight. So first, in terms of public health, one of the challenges that we saw was looking at the current COVID-19 pandemic. And we saw that the United States in particular was too reliant on China for PPE. And so one of the recommendations that we came with was that the United States, Japan, and Korea can ally shore so they can kind of share their stockpile among trusted allies. Another opportunity that we were looking at was to have each country, rather than trying to cover all aspects of public health on its own, try to play to their areas of competitive advantage. So during this pandemic, we've seen that Japan has among the fewest COVID-19 fatalities. South Korea utilizes expertise and technology to expedite the contact tracing process, and the United States deployed vaccination at a really rapid rate. So we wanted to make sure that all 3 of these countries played to their strengths here. In addition, with Japan and South Korea, unfortunately have faced a number of health outbreaks in the past, such as SARS and MERS. And so we wanted to make sure that existing organizations such as JICA and COICA included exporting Japanese and South Korean expertise in health crisis and disaster management throughout the Indo-Pacific region. Next, as we look at climate change, during these roundtable discussions with next generation leaders, we saw that nuclear power is an increasingly area of potential for these 3 countries. So for instance, there are a lot of bilateral collaborations that already exist. So for instance, South Korea, a South Korean company called SK Group is already investing in a US company called TerraPower. And so we can kind of build upon existing bilateral cooperation between private sector organizations in order to allow the 3 countries to burden share in order to offset any high costs or lengthy project cycles that exist. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the rise of China has been an area of concern in all 4 issue areas that we discussed. And so one way to kind of circumvent and be able to diversify away from Chinese supply chains is to develop and commercialize hydrogen for products such as electrical vehicles. Next, we looked at foreign aid. And so similar to the other issues covered, we really wanted to stress dividing and conquering between the 3 countries when they collaborate. So given that Japan and South Korea regularly face natural disasters which puts them in a strategic position to share lessons learned with other countries in the region, we thought that they can play a leading role in this area, while the United States can more guide. For instance, USAID can help utilize its experience providing global development assistance to help guide Japan and South Korea further their impact in the Indo-Pacific. And lastly, the last issue of global public goods that we discussed was democratic principles. So this is obviously a really hefty topic to cover, but one issue that we faced and looked at was finding the right balance of using foreign aid as a tool to encourage progress towards democratization without hindering relationship building. So one thing that we wanted to highlight was to slowly allow for democratic promotion by providing actionable items and actionable support. So for instance, the building blocks of democracy, rule of law, good governance, judicial and legal systems, they have yet to be fully institutionalized in Southeast Asia. And so all three countries, the US, Japan, and South Korea, can provide expertise in different areas of this. And then one more issue that we covered is gender, which is a really hefty topic as well. But I think one of the issues that we faced was looking at East Asian traditional and cultural norms that often pose barriers to gender progress. And we were wondering what are good ways for the three countries to work together to overcome these barriers. And so we thought one recommendation worth offering is that to couple both legislation and policies with civil society dialogue. So making sure to have all three countries, not only at the top level, but also to have people in the civil society level talking to one another to further progress in gender. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Another great and comprehensive explanation. And this really shows the breadth of the different aspects of the issues that this report tackled. That was a tremendous overview. So before I go to Rosa and Eleanor, I just want to plant a seed for a speed round that I'm going to do after we hear from Rosa and Eleanor, is I would like each one of our panelists, each one of the six of you, to identify one recommendation from the report and just zero in on it and briefly just make the case about what to do and why in a way that especially for people who are not really as steeped in these issues, we can really have those as the takeaways. And think about it, that would be the sort of thing, maybe your elevator speech. If you get your one shot in the elevator with the prime minister or the national security advisor, what's your elevator speech on that one recommendation? So, but before we do that, so it gives you a little bit of time to think about it. So, but before we do that, I'd like to go to the other two members of our panel. And first, we'll go to Rosa. And again, it's great to see you again. It's been a while. And I know that you got a new job since the last time we saw each other, and you're very focused on counterproliferation and non-proliferation issues in your new responsibilities. And this is something that comes up in the report, right? And as the report noted, there are differences in views and some challenges there, but it also strikes me thinking about it. This is also a place where there's a lot of common interest between the three countries, right? I mean, there is, I think, a deep, abiding understanding of the threat of WMD proliferation writ large and why that's bad for the security of all three of those countries. And so do you have any specific thoughts, either things that you wanted to pull out of the report or things that you would add or that came up in the conversations, Rosa, that you'd like to highlight steps or particular aspects of this issue as it relates to non-proliferation and counterproliferation?
Sure, Marcus. Thank you so much. And it's great to see you. It has been a little while. Yes, as you shared, I have joined a new organization. It's called CRDF Global, and I am a senior project lead in charge of the Countering Sanctions Evasion by the DPRK. So I've just joined in June of this year, and I'm very thankful to the Atlantic Council for having me here. It was great to be a part of these roundtables. It was a real honor. And yeah, just to answer I think both questions on which recommendation I wanted to hone in on, as well as the answer to your second question. Something that I really wanted to focus on was the recommendation to formalize our trilateral cooperation in the security realm. I found that to be really interesting. And I think more than having all the answers, I have all these questions coming up. What does that look like? How do we formalize it? What avenues can we take? So just to start to begin to progress on these questions, I just wanted to focus on the fact that this is a really unique time in history to pursue trilateral cooperation. As everyone saw, we saw some like really drastic political swings in all three countries. And this is the time to take action trilaterally. And so where that formalization can take place, I'm really interested to see that in the future. I don't have the answer to that per se, but I think North Korea, obviously, like you said, Marcus, is a kind of an easy place to agree that this is a major security concern. And I think there is a lot of potential there. So on North Korea, some points I just wanted to make was that Kim Jong-un has been at this for a lot longer than our leaders in the US, in South Korea, and in Japan. And he's set himself up since 2011 with his national strategic priorities of Pyeongjin, while we in the trilateral realm with the US, Japan, and South Korea, we've swung back and forth politically, and we haven't necessarily had such a solid strategic plan in place in the long term since 2011. But North Korea has. So I just wanted to point that out. And I think for us trilaterally, it really is a long-term problem. And with this political environment, which is so unique, I think this is our time to pursue some great work together. One thing in particular that I wanted to focus in on for security cooperation was sanctions enforcement. A lot of the legal mechanisms are already there. We have our UN sanctions, we have our Security Council resolutions, we all have our unilateral sanctions as well. That's already laid out for us. So I think that could potentially be a very easy first step for us to work more closely trilaterally. And what does this mean? So, of course, the implementations, the purpose of it is to counter the WMD missile threat posed by North Korea. But I think the threat has evolved in such at a very fast pace, and evolved into something that we didn't really see maybe 10 years ago. So not only is like traditional security concerns in terms of sanctions enforcement still applicable, for example, in the maritime space, in the money laundering space, but we also see the North Korean threat in the crypto space now, in the cyber space. It has evolved so much. And this also leads to that potential that I was talking about for the trilateral cooperation. Another point I wanted to make in reaction to the brief, something that the brief mentioned was working together multilaterally. And I think that was quite interesting because right now at the UN, we kind of see this political void. That's the best way I can describe it, a political void right now because of the Security Council and the way that it is. We see countries like China, Russia, Venezuela, these group of friends, as they call themselves, they're quite active at the UN. And I know that there's a lot of frustration among the trilateral countries, among the US, Japan, and South Korea. There's this frustration that not much can be done at the UN because of this stalemate, this political void, because the UN Security Council cannot progress on many security challenges. However, I think there is room at the UN for us as the trilateral countries to come together and pursue some very interesting mutual security goals. So I'm not sure if I answered all your questions, Marcus, but those were just some of the main points that I wanted to emphasize.
That's great. And to be fair, I asked some very open-ended and complex questions, so we could have had an entire panel discussion just on that one question. And so Rosa, that in your comments you embedded some focus on the recommendation there. So was that your one recommendation in addition? Did we get a kind of a 2-for-1 special there in your answer?
I think it was a 2-for-1 special to focus on that the formalization of this trilateral cooperation.
All right, no, that's great. All right, and so now I'm gonna ask another not particularly simple question to Eleanor, and so I've been really interested in reading some of your writing on the Japanese position on Taiwan and how that's changed, and particularly Abe's role in that. And so Eleanor, I'm really curious whether it comes from the military perspective of deterrence or the perspective of buffering against Chinese economic coercion, or it comes from looking at supply chain issues. How does Taiwan? I know it's very sensitive, but how do Taiwan considerations factor in to the trilateral cooperation? How should we think about that, both again in the context of what's in the report and maybe your own thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you, Marcus, for that very difficult but very important question. Before I get to that, though, I want to also thank the Atlantic Council for inviting me to participate in these roundtables, as well as participating in today's talk. I also just want to make the standard disclaimer that I am here on my own personal capacity, and whatever views I may share today are not reflective of my employer, the Asia Group. So during the virtual roundtables, I will add that I did not talk about Taiwan per se, if I remember correctly. For those who don't know, Marcus was asking that question because I wrote a piece earlier this year with my friend Riley Walters from the Hudson Institute, who's a deputy director of the Japan chair there, on the late Prime Minister Abe's Taiwan legacy, and it was published through the Hudson Institute. And we had the rare opportunity to meet him virtually about his takes on Taiwan. To answer your questions about, what's the biggest reason why perhaps Abe saw Taiwan as a major concern from a Japanese foreign policy perspective, it's a myriad of things. I think number one is Xi Jinping's intentions. I think the fact that, especially, of course, Abe died before the 20-party Congress, but the fact that Xi Jinping was able to consolidate his power through a third, unprecedented third term in office, that sparked, concern, of course, in Japan. And of course, what happened, the aftermath of Nancy Pelosi's visit, although to be clear, that was also after Abe died, and the 5 missiles landing in Japan's exclusive economic zone for the first time, that definitely was not just attention grabbing, but that was very concerning for decision makers and observers of the Japan space. I think the economic implications and the supply chain choke points associated with China, especially since COVID-19, that's definitely kind of accelerated Abe's thinking that, Japan, Tokyo does need to change its strategic outlook vis-a-vis Taiwan. To be clear, not to the point where if there is a military contingency that Japan should come in defense of Taiwan. But after we interviewed Abe, we interviewed Abe before the Ukraine was invaded. So after Ukraine was invaded, Abe garnered headlines because he said that the United States should formally shelve away its policy of strategic ambiguity and formally adopt strategic clarity in the event that Taiwan is invaded. So he also mentioned that, during the interview that Japan had recently, for the first time, basically financed a foreign entity, in this case, TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Company, or manufacturing company, to create a fab in Japan's southernmost island of Kyushu, in Kumamoto Prefecture specifically. So I think there are a combination of reasons. I don't think it's just the hard security elements or just the economic aspects of Japan's relationship with China, or just any, I guess, other like-minded countries' relationship with China that drove his way of thinking. In terms of the trilateral cooperation aspect, we didn't really touch on that during our interview with Abe, but at the same time, since speaking with Abe, I'm trying to, see, be more observant about how other countries are perceiving a potential Taiwan conflict. And although South Korea, I'll let the South Korea observers here correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem like South Korea observers or decision makers seem to be as outspoken about, the need to, I guess, bolster Taiwan's democratic progress across multiple spectrums, whether that be economic, whether that be representation in multilateral fora. Because, Japan has at least said, Taiwan should be able to join CPTPP as a member, and both Taiwan and China are still still in the application stage, early stages of the application process. But I think going forward, as we, the next gen or whatever we call ourselves, look at Taiwan in the trilateral cooperation progress standpoint, at the very least, I'm sure Taiwan will be featured more prominently in these talks amongst the higher senior officials, whether that be only in the trilateral context or certainly definitely in the bilateral context, like US-Japan, security dialogues 2+2, US-ROK security or economic dialogues. But I still think, though, that there are some constraints to that, because even before, I guess I would say, COVID-19, I think there are other priorities that the three countries have still together, which I think Rosa outlined some of it, and other panelists do about North Korea, for example. So I'll stop there. I hope I kind of answered your question, but happy for you to push back a little bit further, Marcus, if you like.
Yeah, I think it underscores the challenge, right, is that this is still an emerging issue. It's difficult to talk about. And then Japan's position is clearly shifting. The U.S. position, of course, has shifted. And of course, the ROK, as a matter of policy, maintains a certain degree of ambiguity. But I do sense there are some tectonic shifts going on underneath the surface as well. So, but this is definitely something, though, that the next gen, or as I'm saying now, the now gen of scholars is really going to have to deal with as their careers come into full blossom. So good luck, and I'll certainly be there trying to help from the background. But this is something that your generation is really going to have front and center, I think, for good and bad. So we'll come back to you, though, Eleanor, since you didn't give us the 2-for-1 special like Rosa did. And I'd like to do the lightning round, and this is where I'd like to wrap up the solely moderated discussion. And I would like to go to questions, because I think that one of the values of these events is to give an audience members a chance to ask questions, even if they do have perhaps a tie to one of the panelists, as you can see in the Q&A. I actually set my phone on mute, and somehow it went off, so I'm not sure what happened there. But anyway, but to be clear, this is a lightning round that we're going to do here, and remember, it's just one recommendation, your elevator speech, zero in on it quick, and leave the audience with something that, even if they don't understand all the nuances in the background of the issue, something that okay, hey, I really need to take this away with me. So all right, and so we'll go to Lauren.
Thank you, Marcus. And that is a very hard question. I feel like all of these recommendations are things that we really narrowed down to the most important, because there are so many that we wanted to handle. But I think one that sort of overarches all of our sections, and I think is really important, is going to new frontiers. And I really want to highlight cyber, which Rosa already talked about a little bit, but especially now as we're seeing this growth in the use of cyber and, the gray zone, et cetera. And we see it not only on attacks on power grids, we see sort of information sharing, data governance, online privacy, et cetera. We see all of these opportunities in which, both on a security side and on a personal side, we can take damage on the cyber frontier. So I think that's really important to focus on this new frontier, especially, one, due to the dangers of it, and two, due to the less emotionally fraught nature of cyber. It's such a new frontier that there's not these sort of lines drawn, these red lines that will cause a large amount of confrontation with either China, North Korea, or amongst each other. So I think that can happen in multiple ways, whether that be information sharing, like we said, or it could be even cyber exercises for if there's an attack on the power grid, or trying to go against illegal money laundering or crypto, like Rosa said. I just think that cyber is one of the biggest areas that we can work on across all frontiers. And so I think that is my elevator speech.
All right, Lauren, excellent. And cyber is just such an important emerging issue, and one very appropriate for the rising generation of experts, because it's only going to get more important. So I love it. All right, so let's go to Sang-Hyun. What's your elevator speech? What's the one recommendation? Where should we focus?
Thank you, Marcus. And like Lauren said, there's so many like great points made by the groups, so it's really tough to choose the best one, especially under the assumption that I'm presenting this in front of the like president or like a higher level officer. So, but anyway, I'll pick the one, and I'll pick the like our like recommendation on constructing international system of emerging technologies in the light of timely manner and the feasibility. So as we all know, and also the third challenge you would mention, that intensified corporate competition on science technology could actually be an opportunity to show like solidarity from democratic sides. Based on the like shared democratic values and norms, I think a trilateral cooperation can strive to creating principles such as ethical standard of AI, or like trusted and secure flow of data. And having said that, I feel like we can see that there's a contest between the notion of data sovereignty reflected by the data localization law, which you should actually physically construct the local data storage in within the sovereign territory, versus the free and the secure flow of data. And I think this is where trilateral cooperation, especially in like science and technology sector, can play a role. US and Japan agreed to launch a bilateral digital economic partnership, and South Korea is actually trying to join the digital economic partnership agreement is underway. And also this data issues is always recognized by all the joint summits and the joint statements from like all stakeholders. So based on this kind of common interest, I think three countries can also begin to kind of begin a discussion on like designing, like how can like three countries can design international data governance based on the shared like democratic values.
I like it, combining values with technology. I think that will resonate very much, I think, with a lot of key audiences. That's another great recommendation. All right, so let's go to Kyoko. What's your elevator speech on this?
Great, thanks, Marcus. And as Lauren and Sang-Hyun have already said, it's obviously a really tough question to answer, so I will choose to focus on a personal passion of mine, which is gender. So one of the 4 issues that we covered under global public goods was democratic values, and one of those democratic values is gender progress and female empowerment. And so I think one recommendation that we drew from all 3 topics was that trilateral cooperation, in order for it to be successful and long-lasting, has to be implemented at all levels. So it can't just be at the top level, at the government, high level, head of state level, but it also has to be coupled with buy-in and support from civil society and the people of all 3 countries. And so when it comes to gender, I think, as I alluded to earlier, Japan and South Korea have made a lot of meaningful strides in gender. And so, however, there's definitely still this gap between policies that are implemented versus policies that are created versus it actually being realized in practice. So, for instance, in terms of parental leave, so Japanese and Korean citizens have the option to take advantage of paid family leave, but both countries are seen struggling to encourage male parents to utilize this benefit. So I think that kind of highlights that if it's just on one side, we just have legislation and policies that are there, it's not enough. There needs to be more cross-national civil society exchanges in order to yield progress on these fundamental democratic principles. So one such example would be the Me Too movement, which is a prime example of a social movement that obviously began in the United States, but gained particular traction with Korean women. So I think that kind of illustrates this need to have top-down and then bottom-up movements in order to encourage change in a specific issue. Thank you.
That's great. So we have like a progression here. So we started with a technologically focused issue on cyber. Then we talked about the intersection of a technological issue with a values issue. And then now we have a societal values area for cooperations. So this is great. I think these are mutually supporting. All right. So we've got Rose's recommendation about the enforcement of sanctions and the focus on counterproliferation. And so now, Eleanor, can you take us home with the end of the speed round here of what's your run recommendation on this trilateral cooperation issue set that you really want to focus on?
Sure. I emphasized this during, I think, our first private virtual roundtable, and it's about workforce development in these strategic technologies. So one area of interest of mine is the talent shortage in the semiconductor industry. I'm not as well versed about the talent shortages in other strategic technologies industries, so I'm not going to speak for them, but I do know that within the semiconductor industry, there is definitely a dearth in human talent, especially at the high skill end. And I think going forward, if we're going to talk about, these technologies and the intersection of science and policy going forward, I think the onus is on us as the next gen, or the gen, as you like to call the current generation, as you like to call it, Marcus, to consider, the people who are going to make these deliverables happen in terms of the science policies that we want to implement. So I think, I think Sang-Yeon said earlier about how the private sector plays a big role in the science and technologies. And I couldn't agree more. And I'm not just saying that because I do work in the private sector, but I think there's another industry or sector worth adding, and that's higher education. I think higher education has, that's where the innovation thrives. There's a lot of partnerships between private sectors and higher education. So I'm from the state of Indiana originally, and one school called Purdue University, which has a very high, I guess at least country renowned, probably world renowned too, engineering program. They became the first school in the country to implement a semiconductor degree program, I believe both at the undergraduate and graduate level. And so now companies from the semiconductor industry, and not just US specific semiconductor companies, but they've lauded Purdue's this pioneering, effort in creating such program, because there is a need for it, not necessarily just because of the economic security aspects of it, but because there is a great shortage in semiconductors. There was an article titled, I think something about semiconductor kind of being like today's oil. And I kind of do believe in that. I do think that semiconductors are so necessary, and also the talent that it takes to create that one little chip, the amount of countries or entities, I guess, depending on how you look at it, it goes through, it's so complex. And so if we want to, tackle some of the challenges that are the science or the tech industries are facing, we need, as the next gen or the current gen, need more input from those people who are engineers, who are working in the hardcore sciences that I myself can never see myself pursuing ever. But that's my elevator pitch there.
All right, Eleanor, thank you very much. And I see also a relationship, again, going with this theme of how they all connect together. I do see a connection to Kyoko's points on how much societal values are really key to being able to foster and develop and retain the sort of talent to make those things possible, and to be as competitive as we can in the context of all three of the countries in this trilateral grouping. All right, so some great elevator speeches, and I really hope to see all of those recommendations effectively implemented, what we just heard. So now let's transition to a broader discussion with the audience. And there are honestly too many questions in the Q&A queue, I think, at this point to be able to cover them all. So I'm going to have to triage a little bit. And if you all are comfortable, please go ahead and electronically raise your hand if you want to tackle a particular question. But I'm going to direct these as at an individual, and then we can see where we can go from there, if anyone else wants to pile on. And hopefully the person I direct it to isn't too offended by the fact that I'm tossing it in their lap. So fair warning, Lauren. The first question is going to come to you, of course, as the first speaker. So there's a question here from Terrence Mitsuo about non-combatant evacuation operations. I don't know if you can see it in the chat. And is this an area where there can be more trilateral cooperation? In particular, of course, because if Japanese military personnel were involved inside of Korean territory, this could be a pretty sensitive set of issues. So maybe whether or not we put that aside, is this something where you could see in the terms of the defense and security cooperation you've been talking about, could there be more focus on Neil? I obviously spent a little time thinking about these issues, but I would really like to hear your views, and I'm sure the audience would as well. Oh, Lauren, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I refused to unmute for some reason, but I was about to say, I'd love to throw that question back to you, Marcus. You're the expert on this. And that is something that came up, I think, in a couple sessions on this issue of how do we get the militaries working together, especially in areas where jurisdiction becomes an issue. And I know that a big part of the discussion was, in the case of a North Korean contingency, what would happen with the evacuation of different citizens? For example, would the JSDF come in and evacuate their own citizens versus would the US be evacuating citizens, et cetera? And I feel that it is a potential area for cooperation, but exactly like Terrence said, it's going to operate on a lot of sensitivities, particularly when you look back at history and having foreign militaries on Korean soil. I think an issue that we also brought up would be the lack of any sort of contingency planning in these situations. So were the three countries to come together, have a contingency planning session, either at the working level, like we talked about, or at the sort of head of state level, to create these strategies and plans for any sort of crisis scenario, I think that would be a first step, so that if the situation comes up and either Japan is thinking Korea is going to evacuate or the US is going to evacuate, and then their civilians aren't being evacuated, they would of course be forced to come in regardless. So having these discussions, having these working level discussions in particular, I think is definitely a start for cooperation. Whether we make immediate progress on this or not, I think it's something that definitely needs to be handled as we move forward.
Well, Lauren, you raised some good points there, and it actually reminds me of one of the recurring themes of this report is to focus on areas where there's opportunity for cooperation and then work your way toward the more harder, sensitive, and complex problems. And so we might be naturally jumping to the idea of a non-combatant evacuation in the event of, say, like a North Korean attack. That's like a natural thing that makes you think of Neo. But based on what you just said, Lauren, maybe thinking about how the three countries could work together to evacuate citizens, say if there's a natural disaster, somewhere in the South Pacific or say in Africa, where the infrastructure, is going to be it's going to be difficult to get people out without some really some serious movement of assets, civilian and military. That might be a place to start the conversation and save the conversation for what do we do trilaterally in war, for those sorts of a separate set of conversations, and maybe one that takes place in a different context, right? So but I think this idea of thinking about it, how go for the quicker wins and things that are less sensitive to talk about in a public space. So I think that's a great point. Did anyone else want to jump in on this one before we go to the next question? Because I know this one is another one where we could probably have an entire workshop just on non-combatant evacuations around the world, given what we've seen in unfortunately in recent months and years. So then let's go to the question from Mark Tokola, Vice President of the Korea Economic Institute of America. And he asks, can you imagine Korea, Japan, European Union trilateral cooperation, or will Korea and Japan end up competing to be the EU's preferred partner in Northeast Asia? Could nudging the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy in a constructive direction, could that be something that the US, Japan, and Korea could work on jointly? And so I'd like to ask Sang-hyun to tackle that one first, and then maybe Kyoko, if you'd like to provide your perspective as well.
Sure, Marcus. I think it's really like tough question to say, but I think European Union, from the perspective of private sector side, I think they are actually competing against the European like partners. When it comes to like semiconductor supply chain, European is highly investing the semiconductor, the supply chains, and also alongside South Korea and Japan's investment in the the semiconductor part technologies as well. So I think from the industrial standpoint, I think they're competing, but on the at the same time, from the perspective of public sector, I would say there might be plenty of incentives for like 3 or like 4 countries to contribute to collaborate within the science and technology part. Because when we see the recently launched the US and EU like technology trade and technology I think the council could be like representative case. And because like I feel like it's really like TTC is really active right at this point, and given the like nascent stage of like emerging technology, they're really doing a great job in like such like area as digital infrastructure or like connectivities, like new and emerging technologies, and fostering the semiconductor supply chains, as well as promoting their own like democratic values throughout the online like online chambers. And also I just checked the joint statements announced it on the early December, and it really showcased and laid out the actual policy implementations on how like both United States and European Union can actually do or like foster their science and technology in the various disciplines. So I would say, first of all, TTC could be some kind of a reference point for like a trilateral cooperation, but at the same time, I would say it could be like plausible to say like it could be like broadened to concept of like including like all relevant stakeholders.
All right. Yeah, and I think this actually drives home the point that the trilateral cooperation still exists in a multilateral context, right? It all is interrelated. And that's another thing I think that comes across in some of the comments and in the report. But let's go to Kyoko. What are your thoughts on?
Sure. Thank you so much, Marcus. I think one thing that I'll add with regards to Northeast Asia and European cooperation, I think one thing that we've already been seeing in terms of relations between the two regions is given Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine and that causing a really severe challenge to the rules-based international order. We're seeing increasingly there's a lot more dialogue happening between the two regions, but I think there's still a lot of potential to be realized there. We see that Taiwan is playing a really critical role in terms of the struggle between democracy and autocracy, as we see China increasing intimidation, increasing aggressive rhetoric. And so I think there's really a lot of room for increasing dialogue between the two regions. But I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has kind of already started bridging those two regions.
Okay, good point. All right, thank you very much. All right, so we've got some more questions coming, and I'm trying to do a triage here, and we're definitely not going to be able to get to all of them. And this speaks very well to the now generation panel that we have here of the amount of interest that you've generated. And so I'm going to try a few of them here. I think are just really almost philosophical in terms of how tough they are. And so I would like to circle back though on one particular that zeroes in on Japan and Taiwan, and how the Japan's willingness to be more forward-leaning on Taiwan, how that fits in with trilateral cooperation. And so following up a little bit on my question to Eleanor earlier, and so what steps could we see trilaterally? And I'm going to reframe the question a little bit, both within that trilateral relationship to provide support for Taiwan and cooperate on Taiwan issues? And then are there things that trilaterally the countries could work together in that regard as well? Are there incentives, whether it's the geostrategic imperatives, whether there's economic incentives? You reference, of course, the chips being the most important example, or at least the most obvious one, so to speak. And anyone want to volunteer to take this one? I know this one was tough when I tossed it to Eleanor, because this is a place, again, where it's a space where it's sort of on the bleeding edge of these conversations. And if no one wants to volunteer, that's okay. But I just wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity for others to jump in on it. And then if that's something we just need to put a pin in, we can move on to another question. But would anyone like to raise their hand virtually or personally to give that a shot, in addition to what Eleanor had to say on this topic earlier? Is there something to be done in this space, or is it right now just sort of a little bit too hard? All right, Lauren is the brave one, is willing to jump on it. Okay, go ahead, Lauren.
Truly, I'm just building on Eleanor's amazing answer to this earlier, but I think that it's still a bit too early for this. Sort of as Eleanor was saying, we see with South Korea, there's a large hesitance to sort of make strong statements on Taiwan, particularly when it relates to Taiwan and China. It can be a slightly different matter if we're talking about semiconductors and obviously trade issues, but the geostrategic position of Taiwan is something that South Korea is still not quite willing to touch, at least publicly. I'm not in the higher level discussions, I'm sure it comes up, but I think that Japan's movement on this, one, did incentivize other countries to take a firmer stance on this. We see European countries moving forward a bit on speaking about this. We see a bit more shifting in Southeast Asia, though not quite as obvious. But I think that for South Korea, it's still a bit too early, but it is a good step to seeing this large country, it's geostrategically important country, as well as someone that is very reliant on China for a lot of their trade issues, and then as well shares a very close range to China. So I think it's an important step, but I think it's a bit of a far step for Korea to publicly display any sort of support yet. But of course, I defer to my other colleagues as well if they have different opinions.
Yeah, Eleanor, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Well, I, kind of thought further. You guys gave me some food for thought about evacuations. So actually, we've had some, Japanese policymakers visiting Taiwan this past year. And one thing that the Taiwanese government did announce is that Japan and Taiwan have started conversations about how to evacuate Taiwan, helping Japanese citizens evacuate out of Taiwan Island proper. I just can't remember at the moment if that also extends to the Southwest Island chains that are part of Japan, because those islands would definitely be affected in the event of a contingency. I think to Lauren's point, and I guess one of my previous points about a big difference between Japan and South Korea is that, I think Nancy Pelosi's visit, the difference between President Yoon not seeing Nancy Pelosi in person, and then Prime Minister Kishida meeting Nancy Pelosi in person, and then President Moon, if I remember correctly, or his office, saying that the reason why he didn't want to see Nancy Pelosi in person right after her visit to Taiwan was because of national security reasons. I think that itself speaks to the level of restraint that South Korea still does have vis-a-vis Taiwan compared to Japan. But to be fair, both countries, as well as other countries, region and globally, have both constraints and restraints vis-a-vis Taiwan in their engagements, because both, none of the three countries in this trilateral framework have official diplomatic relations with Taiwan. But I think the one thing that I should have thought about earlier is, we don't perhaps in the DC space see the tangible deliverables happening trilaterally speaking when it comes to how the people of, Japanese people or Korean people or Americans interact with their Taiwanese counterparts in higher education or in private sector. So even though to Lauren's point and my point earlier, it may be too early to see, how this may all come about on a trilateral basis, perhaps it already is in a civil society sense, but we just don't see it yet. But I think that will be an interesting space to watch. But I'll end that there so that way we can answer more questions.
All right. Yes, and I feel like a panel coming on trilateral in Taiwan someday in the future. Maybe it'll be a now gen thing going forward. So on this question though of historical issues, right? It's come up a couple of times in the question, so I do feel like we need to address it in some way, and rather than just kind of in in sort of optimistic or pessimistic view, maybe we can, if we could be a little bit more precise and talk about are there particular things that we can do to overcome them, that the now generation, as the question was asked, can actions that can be taken. And I know the report touches on this and it was in some of the conversation, but given the historical issues being such a challenge to trilateral cooperation, would anyone like to weigh in on some thoughts about how to work through some of these historical issues and promote that cooperation going forward? Any thoughts? And again, so we're picking all the real easy ones here tonight, folks. It's or this morning, as the case may be. So recognize that this is another sensitive area, but this is the sort of thing that we need to work through to have improved trilateral cooperation. So would anyone like to weigh in on this one and what can be done? Sang-Hyun, I saw you take off your mute, so go ahead.
I can like jump on the question. I'm not sure actually I'm directly like answering the question itself, but I'm hopefully can answer it. And also this like thoughts might be touched on the first point of the raising about the human resources. So I know that South Korean universities are actually, due to the like human resource shortage problem, they're trying to establish the industry relevant like majors and providing like full scholars as well as guaranteed to get the job from like sponsoring companies. So it's directly connecting the industry sector and the university, and also human like students are there. So, and also I'm not just like following how like Japan is doing in this way, but I'm pretty sure they share like a similar approach, and they might implement their similar approach on like China, like South Korea and United States. And so as like the US and EU TTC can be one like exemplar, I feel like the Quad Fellowship, which was launched like recently, could be another exemplar for like trilateral cooperation. So like if like someone doesn't know about the Quad Fellowship, it's aiming to exchange and nurture the true next generation on STEAM areas who are potentially going to be high skilled laborers, because like they are eligible for like a master and doctoral students. And I feel like the like 3 countries can come up with some kind of this like Quad Fellowship program, such as like launching a like university education consortium on like STEAM area, and which is actually similar to the Campus Asia program happening among like South Korea, Japan, and China right now. So I feel like, I'm not sure like answering the question, but I feel like there might be some kind of like incentive and motivations are there.
I mean, it sounds to me like it's a practical example of things that can be done, these types of fellowships and exposure early in the career and in development of sort of a cadre, as it were, of people in various sectors that are very comfortable with trilateral cooperation despite the historical issues there. I think that's that to me strikes me as a very practical approach. I see Rosa's got her hand up, so Rosa, let's go to you, and then we'll go to Kyoko, and then I think that will probably be about our time. So we just got a few minutes left because we do have closing comments coming from Dr. Koenig. So go ahead, Rosa, then Kyoko.
Thanks, Marcus. I think I just wanted to very quickly support what Sang-Hyun and Eleanor have been saying about trilateral cooperation in terms of this HR space. And something I just wanted to note very quickly, a space where we could really work together right now is in the IT workers space. There is a huge global shortage in the supply of IT workers. And guess who's meeting that gap? North Korea. So I think this is a very interesting space where we could work together trilaterally. And this is totally not answering your history question, but I just wanted to put that out there, that in the IT space, there is just a lot of potential.
All right, and this is a way, though, I think, to overcome the effects of history with this this rising, the now generation, as I'm calling them. All right, so Kyoko, you got about a minute, so go for it.
Okay, great. So I think just adding to what Rosa and Sang-Yan have already said, just kind of going back to my earlier point, making sure that the dialogues, informal and formal, such as this, continue to exist between young leaders, next generation leaders, to make sure that rather than kind of sticking to historical tensions and kind of choosing to focus on that, making sure that young people are continuing to meet each other and continuing to engage with each other in a wide range of issue areas. So one example that I'm thinking of is in terms of public health. So there are a lot of bilateral frameworks, for instance, between US and Japan in terms of allowing for Japanese health professionals to visit and learn from US health institutions. So this is one example that can be expanded beyond the bilateral framework, but also include South Korea, make sure that there are bidirectional exchanges between the three countries to make sure that there are new research discoveries, new technologies shared among the three countries, and to make sure that dialogue is continued regardless of the domestic and political challenges that each country faces.
Oh, that's great. And I think that's a great note to close the panel discussion on. So in some ways, one of the solutions is to continue this very type of program, right? Because it will provide the intellectual capital to be able to come up with new ideas, to advance the relationship, but also it's building those connections that can overcome some of the historical issues. So I think this is a spectacular discussion. I'm really honored to have had the opportunity to moderate. And so at this point, I will introduce the acting director of the Scowcroft Center, Dr. Matthew Koenig. Over to you, Matt.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Marcus, for moderating this event. This is an important challenge. The United States and its allies face a number of challenges with the return of strategic competition, emerging technology, and many others. And I think we've agreed tonight that the solution to these challenges really depend on the United States working more closely with its democratic allies and partners. And when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region, no allies and partners more important than Korea and Japan. So new solutions for trilateral cooperation is so important. And I think tonight that we heard some really innovative solutions in areas from security, global public goods, and science and technology. This isn't, unfortunately, these challenges we face aren't going to be solved overnight. They may be generational long challenges. And so hearing from the next generation, I think, is so important. So I'd really like to thank the authors of our report that we launched tonight, Lauren, Kyoko, and Sang-Yan. Thank you so much. Also like to thank our other panelists tonight, Eleanor and Rosa. Thank you so much for joining us. And Marcus, thank you for doing a terrific job moderating and making it an engaging discussion. And finally, thanks to our partners at the Korea Foundation who made this research possible. I said finally, actually one more finally, thanks to all of you who joined us tonight early in the morning in Asia or late in the evening in Washington. We really appreciate it. And for now, just like to wish you a happy holiday and a happy new year. And the Scowcroft Center will continue to be doing groundbreaking work on Indo-Pacific security in 2023. So please come back and join us after the holidays. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the new year.